The landlord was pointing at the door while rain poured outside, and Michael stood there with his 6-year-old son trembling beside him. 2 years later, that same landlord would be standing in front of Michael again, but this time begging him not to take everything away. This is the story of how a single father kicked out in the rain bought the whole building and changed everything. It was November 1992, and Michael Harris had just lost his factory job 3 weeks earlier. The manufacturing plant in Detroit, where he worked for 8 years, shut down without warning, leaving him and 200 other workers on the street. Michael was a single father, raising his son Tommy after his wife left them 2 years before. He was doing everything possible to keep a roof over their heads, but the money ran out faster than he could find new work. The landlord, Robert Sullivan, owned the apartment building on Maple Street, where Michael and Tommy lived in a small 2-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor. Sullivan was known throughout the neighborhood as a ruthless landlord who cared only about collecting rent on time and nothing about the people living in his buildings. Michael went to Sullivan's office on the 1st floor that cold November evening. He knocked on the door and waited. Sullivan opened it with a scowl already forming on his face. Michael explained his situation calmly. He had been a good tenant for 4 years, never late on rent, never caused problems, always kept his apartment clean. He asked for 2 weeks' extension to pay the rent while he searched for new employment. Sullivan didn't even let him finish talking. The landlord told Michael he didn't care about his problems, didn't care about his son, didn't care that he lost his job. Rent was due on the 1st of the month, and this was the 5th. Sullivan gave Michael exactly 1 hour to pack whatever he could carry and leave the building. Michael tried reasoning with the landlord. He showed Sullivan the job applications he had filled out, the interviews he had scheduled for the following week. He promised he would pay everything he owed, plus an additional month's rent, as soon as he got back on his feet. Sullivan refused to listen. The landlord crossed his arms and said he had a waiting list of tenants who could pay on time, and Michael was wasting space in his building. Tommy was standing behind his father during this conversation, holding onto his dad's jacket, trying not to cry. Sullivan looked at the boy and told Michael that maybe losing the apartment would teach him to be more responsible. That comment made something snap inside Michael, but he kept his composure. He wasn't going to give Sullivan the satisfaction of seeing him break down. Michael went back upstairs and started packing. He had 2 suitcases and 3 garbage bags to fit their entire life into. Tommy helped by gathering his toys and books, asking his father where they were going to sleep that night. Michael didn't have an answer yet, but he told his son everything would be okay. They would figure it out together like they always did. The rain started falling around 7 o'clock that evening, heavy drops that turned into a downpour within minutes. Michael and Tommy carried their belongings down the stairs, getting soaked before they even reached the building entrance. Sullivan was waiting by the front door, making sure they actually left. Other tenants watched from their windows, some with sympathy, others just grateful it wasn't happening to them. Michael looked at the landlord one last time and said something that Sullivan would remember for years. Michael told him that kindness costs nothing, but cruelty always comes with a price. Sullivan laughed and told Michael to save the philosophy lessons for someone who cared. Michael and Tommy walked out into the rain, carrying everything they owned, with nowhere to go. They spent that first night at a shelter on the east side of Detroit. The place was overcrowded, noisy, and smelled like desperation. Tommy couldn't sleep, and Michael stayed awake, watching over his son, promising himself this was temporary. The next morning, Michael made calls to everyone he knew. His brother James lived in Cleveland and offered them a place to stay temporarily. Michael and Tommy took a Greyhound bus there the following day. James worked as a mechanic and had a small house with a spare bedroom. He told Michael to take whatever time he needed to get back on his feet. Michael appreciated the help, but knew he couldn't rely on charity forever. He started applying for every job available in Cleveland, not just in his field, but anything that paid. He worked at a gas station, then got a night shift position at a warehouse. The pay wasn't great, but Michael saved every dollar he could. He worked 16-hour days sometimes, sleeping only 4 or 5 hours, waking up exhausted but determined. Tommy started school in Cleveland, and Michael made sure his son had everything he needed, even when it meant Michael went without. After 6 months of working multiple jobs, Michael had saved enough money to rent a small apartment for him and Tommy. It wasn't much, just a 1-bedroom place where Tommy slept on the bed and Michael took the couch. But it was theirs. Michael kept working, kept saving, kept pushing forward. He took night classes in business management at a community college, studying after Tommy went to sleep, fueled by coffee and determination. Michael never forgot what happened that rainy November night. He never forgot how Sullivan treated him and his son, how the landlord showed zero compassion for a man going through hard times. During his business classes, Michael learned about real estate investment, property management, and tenant rights. He discovered that Sullivan's treatment of him that night had actually violated several housing regulations, but Michael never pursued legal action. Revenge wasn't his motivation. Success was. Michael got promoted at the warehouse after a year, becoming a shift supervisor with better pay. He kept saving, kept studying, kept planning. Tommy was doing well in school, making friends, adjusting to their new life. Michael started investing small amounts in the stock market, using knowledge from his business classes. Some investments failed, but others paid off. By 1994, Michael had saved $15,000, a fortune for someone who had been homeless 2 years earlier. He started looking at investment properties, small houses that needed work, apartments he could fix up and rent out. Michael bought his first property in early 1995, a duplex that needed repairs. He did most of the work himself on weekends, learning plumbing, electrical work, carpentry. He rented both units and used that income to buy another property. Michael was building an empire slowly, methodically, one property at a time. He treated his tenants with respect, worked with them when they had financial difficulties, never forgot where he came from. By late 1995, Michael owned 4 rental properties in Cleveland and had built a reputation as a fair landlord who actually cared about his tenants. Do you think Michael ever thought about going back to Detroit during these years? Drop your answer in the comments below. Then in January 1996, Michael received a call from an old friend who still lived in Detroit. The friend told him that Sullivan was having financial problems. The landlord had overextended himself buying too many properties, and the real estate market in Detroit was declining. Several of Sullivan's buildings were falling into disrepair. Tenants were moving out, and he was struggling to make mortgage payments. Michael listened to this information carefully, and an idea started forming in his mind. He asked his friend to keep him updated on Sullivan's situation. Over the next few months, Michael learned that Sullivan's financial problems were getting worse. The landlord was behind on payments for 3 of his buildings, including the one on Maple Street, where Michael and Tommy had been kicked out. Michael did his research. He found out exactly how much Sullivan owed, who held the mortgages, what the buildings were worth. In August 1996, Michael made his move. He contacted the bank that held the mortgage on the Maple Street building and made an offer to buy the property. The bank was eager to sell because Sullivan was 4 months behind on payments and facing foreclosure. Michael offered cash, closing the deal quickly and quietly. Sullivan didn't know what was happening until it was too late. The bank informed Sullivan that his building had been sold and he had 30 days to vacate the office he maintained on the first floor. Sullivan was shocked, panicked, desperate to know who bought the building. Michael let him wonder for 2 weeks before showing up at the building. It was a Saturday afternoon in September 1996, almost 4 years since that rainy November night. Michael walked into the building wearing a business suit, carrying a briefcase, looking nothing like the desperate man who had been thrown out into the rain. He knocked on Sullivan's office door and waited. Sullivan opened it, not recognizing Michael at first. Then the landlord's face went pale as recognition hit him. Michael smiled and introduced himself as the new owner of the building. He watched Sullivan's expression change from confusion to disbelief to fear. The landlord started talking fast, trying to explain, trying to make excuses, trying to negotiate. Michael let him talk for a minute before holding up his hand for silence. He told Sullivan to sit down because they needed to have a conversation. Sullivan sat, and Michael reminded him of that November night in 1992. He described how Sullivan had kicked a single father and his young son out into the rain without mercy, without compassion, without basic human decency. Sullivan tried to interrupt, tried to say he was just doing business, but Michael wasn't interested in excuses. Michael pulled out a folder from his briefcase containing all the documentation of the building purchase. He showed Sullivan the ownership papers, the mortgage documents, everything that proved Michael now controlled the property. Then Michael did something Sullivan didn't expect. He offered the landlord a choice. Sullivan could leave within 30 days like the bank required, or he could stay and work as the building manager under Michael's ownership. Sullivan was stunned. He asked why Michael would offer him a job after everything that happened. Michael explained that he wasn't the same person Sullivan had kicked out 4 years ago. He had learned that success wasn't about revenge or treating people the way they treated you. Success was about being better, rising above, showing compassion even when you had every right to show none. Michael told Sullivan that everyone deserves a second chance, even people who don't deserve it, because that's what separates good people from cruel ones. Sullivan broke down. The landlord started crying, apologizing, saying he had been wrong about everything. He admitted he had treated countless tenants poorly over the years, always putting profit over people, never caring about their situations or struggles. Sullivan said losing everything had taught him what it felt like to be powerless, to be at someone else's mercy, to face losing everything with nowhere to turn. Michael listened without interrupting. When Sullivan finished talking, Michael laid out the terms. Sullivan could stay as building manager with a modest salary, but things would be different now. Every tenant would be treated with respect. Nobody would be kicked out without exhausting every possible option to help them first. Rent would be fair, maintenance would be prompt, and the building would be a place where people felt safe and valued. Sullivan agreed to every term. He thanked Michael repeatedly, still barely believing what was happening. Michael stood up to leave, then turned back and said one more thing. He told Sullivan that the little boy who stood in that office 4 years ago, watching his father be humiliated, was now a smart, kind, successful student who never forgot that night. Tommy had learned from his father's example that hard times don't define you, your response to them does. Sullivan nodded, understanding the weight of what Michael was saying. Michael walked out of that office as the owner of the building, having turned his lowest moment into his greatest victory, not through revenge, but through success and grace. If this story inspired you, hit that subscribe button right now, because we share stories like this every week about people who overcome impossible odds and change their lives. Don't miss the next one. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Over the next 2 years, Michael bought 2 more buildings from Sullivan as the landlord continued facing financial difficulties. Each time, Michael gave Sullivan the option to stay on as manager, and each time Sullivan accepted, becoming a completely different person in the process. The landlord, who once showed zero compassion, became known throughout Detroit as one of the most tenant-friendly managers in the city. Sullivan worked hard to make up for his past mistakes, going out of his way to help tenants facing difficulties, often advocating to Michael on their behalf. Michael watched this transformation with satisfaction, knowing he had made the right choice. Tommy graduated high school in 1998 with honors and got accepted to the University of Michigan. Michael's real estate portfolio had grown to 12 properties across Cleveland and Detroit, providing steady income and financial security. Father and son had come a long way from that rainy November night when they had nowhere to go and nothing but 2 suitcases and 3 garbage bags. Michael never told Tommy about buying the building or offering Sullivan a second chance until years later. When he finally shared the story, Tommy said he wasn't surprised. His father had always taught him that success means nothing if you become the same kind of person who hurt you along the way. The Maple Street building became one of Michael's most successful properties, always fully occupied, with tenants who stayed for years because they were treated well. Sullivan managed it until he retired in 2005, and on his last day, he thanked Michael again for showing him that people can change when given the opportunity. Michael attended Sullivan's retirement party and gave a speech about second chances and redemption, never mentioning the specifics of their history, but making it clear that everyone in that room had benefited from choosing compassion over revenge. The other tenants and building staff had no idea about the full story, but they understood the message. By 2010, Michael owned 23 properties and had built one of the most respected property management companies in Michigan. He employed 15 people, including several who had once been his tenants facing hard times. Michael created a company policy that no tenant would ever be evicted without the company first offering financial counseling, job placement assistance, and flexible payment plans. This policy cost money in the short term, but built incredible loyalty and reputation in the long term. Michael's buildings maintained 95% occupancy rates even during economic downturns because people knew they would be treated fairly. Tommy graduated from University of Michigan with a business degree and joined his father's company in 2002. Together, they expanded operations into Ohio and Indiana, always maintaining the same principles that guided Michael from the beginning. Treat people with dignity. Offer second chances. Never forget where you came from. Father and son built something bigger than a real estate empire. They built a legacy of compassion in an industry often known for the opposite. The story of the single father kicked out in the rain who came back to buy the whole building became legendary in Detroit real estate circles, though Michael rarely told it himself. Sullivan passed away in 2012, and Michael spoke at his funeral. He finally told the complete story publicly, explaining how the landlord who had shown him no mercy had been given a second chance and transformed his life. Sullivan's family thanked Michael afterward, saying they had always wondered what changed their father from a bitter, cruel man into someone kind and generous. Now they knew. Michael explained that people aren't defined by their worst moments if they're willing to learn and change. Sullivan had done exactly that, spending 13 years making amends for decades of poor treatment toward others. The Maple Street building still stands today, now worth more than 10 times what Michael paid for it in 1996. A small plaque in the lobby tells the story of the building's transformation from a place where a single father was kicked out in the rain to a place that represents second chances and redemption. Current tenants read that plaque and understand they're not just renting an apartment. They're part of a story about overcoming adversity, choosing compassion, and building something meaningful. Michael, now in his 60s, still owns the building and several others, though Tommy handles most of the daily operations. That rainy November night in 1992 could have broken Michael Harris. Instead, it became the foundation for everything he built afterward. The pain, humiliation, and struggle of being kicked out with his young son pushed Michael to succeed, not just financially, but as a human being. He proved that success isn't measured only by wealth or property ownership, but by how you treat people when you have the power to hurt them, the same way you were once hurt. Michael chose a different path, and that choice changed not just his life and Tommy's life, but Sullivan's life, and the lives of hundreds of tenants who benefited from living in buildings managed with compassion and respect. What would you have done in Michael's situation when you became the landlord's new boss? Would you have offered him a second chance, or would you have kicked him out the same way he kicked you out? Share your thoughts in the comments because we want to hear different perspectives on this. The single father kicked out in the rain, bought the whole building and transformed it into something beautiful. The landlord who showed no mercy learned what mercy looked like when he least deserved it. Tommy grew up understanding that your response to hard times matters more than the hard times themselves. These lessons echoed through decades, touching lives in ways both big and small, proving that sometimes the best revenge is no revenge at all, just success, grace, and the wisdom to break cycles instead of continuing them. Michael Harris turned his worst night into his greatest teaching moment, and the Maple Street building stands as permanent proof that compassion and business success aren't opposites, but partners in building something that lasts.